The dirt under my fingernails was still fresh. The dark soil caked into the creases of my skin as a permanent reminder of the nightmare I had lived through. It had been exactly 3 days since I stood in the pouring rain, watching the mahogany casket containing Julian, my husband, my world, my light, disappear into the black maw of the earth. They say the first few days of grief are a blur, a protective fog the brain uses to keep you from shattering. But for me, the fog was replaced by a hyper-awareness that made every sound in our empty house feel like a gunshot. I sat in our darkened bedroom, the air heavy with the scent of wilting funeral lilies and the lingering, heartbreaking smell of his cedarwood cologne. The silence was so absolute it was deafening. I stared at the unmade side of the bed, the indentation in the pillow still visible, a ghost of the man who had been there just a week ago. I reached out to touch the fabric, my breath hitching as I realized the sheets were cold, unnaturally cold. Then the mattress dipped. My heart didn't just race, it stopped. I watched in frozen, paralyzed horror as the silk sheets pulled back, as if moved by an invisible hand. Slowly, a figure began to manifest out of the shadows of the corner, shimmering like moonlight on water. It was a hand at first, pale, translucent, with fingers that looked like they were made of smoke. That hand reached out and brushed against my cheek. Hallucinations don't feel like this. Hallucinations don't leave a trail of frost on your skin. Did you really think, a voice whispered, sounding like the rustle of wind through dry autumn leaves, that a little bit of earth could keep me from coming home to you, Clara? The scream died in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't blink. It was him. It was Julian. But his eyes, once a warm, molten chocolate brown that made me feel safe, were now glowing with a soft, ethereal blue light that belonged to the stars, not the earth. He wasn't the man I had kissed goodbye on Tuesday morning before he headed to work. He was something beautiful, fragile, and utterly terrifying, a bridge between two worlds that were never meant to touch. I reached out, my fingers trembling so violently I thought I might break, expecting to touch empty air. Instead, my fingertips met a cold, electric hum. It was like touching a low-voltage wire, a vibration that rattled my very bones. Julian. I managed to choke out, the name feeling like a prayer and a curse. As soon as I spoke, the energy in the room surged. The light bulbs in the hallway exploded in a shower of sparks, and the temperature plummeted until I could see my own breath puffing out in white clouds. He leaned in, his lips hovering an inch from mine, and I felt a pull in my chest, a spiritual gravity that wanted to drag my soul right out of my body. He wasn't here to say a final goodbye. He wasn't here to tell me everything would be okay. He was here because the afterlife had rejected him, because his love for me was a tether so strong it had pulled him back through the veil. But as I looked into those glowing blue eyes, I saw something behind him, a flicker of movement in the shadows that wasn't him. Something dark, ancient, and hungry had followed him back through the tear he'd made in the universe. Julian's expression shifted from love to a sudden, sharp alertness. He stood up, his form flickering like a bad television signal, his translucent chest heaving as if he were trying to remember how to breathe. "The gate is still open, Clara," he warned, his voice gaining a hollow metallic resonance. And I wasn't the only thing that crawled out of that hole. The scratching started then. Not from the door but from inside the walls, a sound like 1,000 fingernails raking against wood, desperate to get in. I looked at the man I had buried 3 days ago and realized that my mourning was over, but my nightmare had only just begun. We weren't just a widow and a ghost, we were targets. Julian reached for my hand again, and this time the cold didn't bite. It felt like a shield. "We have until the moon sets to seal the room," he said, his blue light flaring until the shadows in the corner hissed and retreated. "Because if they get to me, they'll take you back to the gray place just to punish me for coming home." The love that had defined our lives hadn't ended at the grave. It had just become a weapon in a war between the living and the dead. The morning brought no sunlight to our bedroom, only a stagnant gray haze that seemed to cling to the furniture like a physical weight. Julian stood by the window, his form more solid than it had been at midnight, but he remained a haunting spectacle of light and mist. He was staring at the glass, where ice crystals had formed in the intricate shape of skeletal hands, despite the sweltering July heat outside. I sat on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching a man I had seen lowered into the ground just days ago. The grief that had been crushing my chest was gone, replaced by a sharp, jagged adrenaline that made my teeth chatter. "The coffee is ready," Julian said softly. I looked toward the kitchen and saw the steam rising from the pot, but the kitchen was a frozen tomb. He couldn't touch the ceramic mugs for long without them shattering from the cold, but he had managed to move the air, to manipulate the world just enough to perform the ritual of our morning routine. It was a gesture of love so mundane and yet so supernatural that it made me sob. He turned to look at me and the blue light in his eyes flared. "Don't cry, Clara. If you break, the barrier thins. They feed on despair. It's like a beacon for them." "Who are they, Julian?" I whispered, my voice raw. He moved across the room, not walking so much as gliding, the floorboards not even creaking beneath him. He knelt before me, his hands hovering over my knees. The heat from my body seemed to be sucked into his cold aura. "The collectors," he explained, his voice gaining that hollow, echoing resonance again. "They are the keepers of the border. The universe is a machine of balance and I have jammed the gears. I was supposed to be a memory, a name on a stone. By coming back, I've left a door open behind me and they are the ones tasked with slamming it shut, no matter who is standing in the way." As he spoke, the scratching from the walls grew louder, a rhythmic, frantic thudding that seemed to be coming from the very foundation of the house. The shadows in the corners of the ceiling began to drip like black ink, pooling on the floor. Julian hissed, a sound that wasn't human, and stood tall. His form expanded, his blue light burning with a fierce, blinding brilliance that pushed the shadows back. "They'll use your memories against you, Clara. They'll look like people you love. They'll sound like me. But if you let them in, if you believe their lies, the house will no longer be a sanctuary. It will become a bridge to the gray place, and once you cross it, there is no coming back." I stood up, the blanket falling from my shoulders. I reached out and did something I hadn't dared to do since he manifested. I walked into his light. The cold was agonizing, 1,000 needles of ice pricking my skin, but beneath the frost, I felt the familiar hum of his soul. It was Julian. Every atom of him was the man I had loved since I was 19. "Then we fight," I said, my voice steady for the first time. "I didn't lose you to a car accident just to lose you to a shadow. If they want you, they have to go through me." Julian's expression softened, a flicker of the man he used to be shining through the celestial mask. He reached up, his translucent thumb tracing the line of my jaw, and for a fleeting second, I could almost feel the warmth of his skin. "I died saving a soul on that road, Clara," he whispered. "I saw a tear in the world and I swerved to avoid it. I thought I was being a hero, but I was just being a casualty. But being here, seeing you, I'd die 1,000 more times just for this 1 hour of gray light." The peace was shattered by a heavy, booming knock at the front door. It wasn't the knock of a neighbor or a friend. It was a sound that vibrated through the marrow of my bones. "Clara," a voice called out from the other side. It sounded exactly like my father, who had been dead for 10 years. "Clara, it's cold out here. I mean, honey. I've brought Julian back to you." I moved toward the door, my heart leaping with a primal, desperate hope, but Julian's hand clamped onto my arm. His touch was like a band of liquid nitrogen, jolting me back to reality. "It's not him," Julian growled, his blue light turning a dangerous, electric violet. "Look at the shadows under the door, Clara. Look at the feet." I looked down. There were no feet. Only 2 wisps of black smoke that were seeping through the cracks of the door, curling like serpents across the hardwood floor. The collectors weren't coming for him anymore. They were coming for the woman who was holding the door open. The scratching in the walls had stopped, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like the house had been submerged underwater. I stood in the hallway, my eyes locked on the black smoke curling across the floorboards. Julian stood between me and the door, his form flickering violently, his blue light casting long, distorted shadows that danced against the peeling wallpaper. He didn't look like my husband anymore. He looked like a celestial soldier, his edges sharp and jagged with static. "Don't look at the door, Clara," he commanded, his voice vibrating in my chest. "They are trying to synchronize with your heartbeat. If your pulse matches their knocking, you'll open that door without even realizing your hand is moving." I forced my gaze away, staring instead at the large, ornate mirror at the end of the hall, a wedding gift from Julian's mother. But the reflection wasn't right. The hallway in the mirror was decaying. The wallpaper was rotting off the walls in the reflection, and the ceiling was dripping with a thick, viscous black oil. In the mirror, Julian wasn't a glow of blue light. He was a gray, hollow-eyed corpse, his suit torn and caked with the very dirt I had watched fall onto his casket. I gasped, stepping back, but Julian grabbed my shoulders. "Don't look at the reflection either," he hissed. "The mirrors are the weak points. They show the truth of the gray place. They show what I am becoming if we don't finish the anchor." Suddenly, the glass of the mirror didn't shatter. It melted. The surface became liquid, rippling like a dark pond, and a hand emerged. It was a hand made of bone and tattered gray rags, followed by a face that was nothing but an empty, hooded void. I watched in horror as a collector began to pull itself out of the mirror and into our reality. It didn't make a sound, but the air in the hallway turned so cold that the skin on my face began to crack. Julian roared, a sound that wasn't human, and lunged at the entity. When they collided, it wasn't a physical crash. It was an explosion of light and shadow that threw me against the wall. Julian struggled with the creature, his blue light clashing against the collector's gray abyss. With every second he fought, Julian's form grew dimmer, as if the entity was drinking the very light that kept him here. "Clara! The salt!" he shouted, his voice sounding like it was coming from miles away. "The kitchen. Under the sink. Circle the mirrors." I scrambled to my feet, my lungs burning with the freezing air. I ran to the kitchen, my fingers fumbling with the cabinets until I found the heavy bag of rock salt we used for the driveway in winter. I rushed back to the hallway, shaking the salt out in a frantic line across the base of the mirror. As soon as the salt touched the floor, the liquid surface of the glass hardened instantly. The collector's arm, still protruding from the mirror, was severed with a sound like a wet branch snapping. The entity let out a high-pitched subsonic shriek that shattered every light fixture in the house, and then it vanished back into the silver depths, leaving behind only a pile of gray rags that turned to ash before they hit the ground. Julian slumped against the wall, his light so faint I could barely see him. He looked transparent, a mere suggestion of a man. I ran to him, reaching out to hold him, but my hands passed right through his chest. I felt nothing but a numbing, soul-deep cold. "Julian, talk to me. Stay with me," I begged. He looked up at me, his blue eyes flickering like a dying candle. "There's something I didn't tell you, Clara," he whispered, the words barely audible. "The car accident. It wasn't just a tear in the world. I didn't just swerve to save a soul. I saw you." I froze. "What do you mean you saw me?" Julian's form flickered, showing the gray, dusty version of himself from the mirror for a split second. "In the gray place, time doesn't exist. I saw you 10 years from now, broken, alone, and followed by these things. I realized that my death was the doorway they were going to use to get to you. I didn't come back just because I loved you, Clara. I came back because I'm the only one who can close the door I opened by dying. But the cost is higher than I thought." He looked at the mirror, which was already beginning to ripple again. "They don't just want me. They want the memory of us. To stay here, to be solid enough to fight them, I have to feed the anchor. And it only eats the things we cherish most." The house began to groan, the floorboards twisting like living wood as the very reality of our home started to dissolve. Outside the windows, the familiar street was gone, replaced by an endless, swirling vortex of gray fog and the distant, rhythmic thud of thousands of unseen feet. The basement was our last stand, a cold, concrete bunker that felt more like a tomb than a shelter. Julian sat in the center of the room, his form so translucent that I could see the furnace behind him through his chest. He was fading, the light of his soul being bled dry by the atmosphere of the gray place leaking into our world. "The anchor, Clara," Julian gasped, his voice a fading echo. "It's ready, but it's empty. It needs a soul weight. It needs a piece of us that is so real, so powerful, that the universe cannot deny my right to exist." He pointed to the silver locket I held in my hand, a gift he had given me on our 5th anniversary. It was cold, vibrating with a dark, hungry energy. To fill it, I had to offer up a memory, Not just a casual thought but a core piece of my identity. I had to let it go forever, erasing it from my mind as if it had never happened. I knelt before him, the concrete biting into my knees. Which one, Julian? Which memory do I give? He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated agony. The most powerful one we have. The day of the wedding. Not the ceremony, Clara. But the moment after. When we stood on the cliffs, the wind blowing the salt spray into our faces, and we realized that for the first time in our lives we weren't alone. That memory is the strongest tether we have to the living world. If you give it up, I will become solid. I will be able to drive them back. But I will be a stranger to you in that moment. You will look at the photos of that day and feel nothing but confusion. I closed my eyes, reaching into the vault of my mind. I could see it so clearly. The smell of the ocean, the way Julian's tuxedo was slightly wrinkled, the taste of the champagne, and the overwhelming, terrifyingly beautiful realization that my life was no longer just mine. It was the foundation of who I was. To lose it was to lose a part of my soul. But then I looked at the flickering, dying ghost of the man who had died to save me. I saw the blue light in his eyes dimming, the gray shadows of the collectors creeping up his legs like vines of smoke. Do it, I whispered, my voice thick with tears. I pressed the locket to my forehead and envisioned the memory. I visualized the cliffs, the blue water, the warmth of his hand in mine. I felt the joy of that afternoon, the absolute certainty of our future. And then I pushed the memory into the silver metal. It felt like a physical tearing, a mental amputation that left a screaming void in my mind. 1 second the memory was there, vivid and warm. The next it was gone. I knew that we had gotten married, I knew the facts, but the feeling, the soul of the event, was vanished. It was just a cold fact in a history book. The locket exploded with a brilliant, blinding violet light. The energy surged through my arms and into Julian. For the first time since the accident, I heard the sound of a heartbeat, loud, rhythmic, and powerful. His form solidified. The blue light didn't just glow, it roared. His skin regained its color, and the air around him shifted from the freezing cold of the grave to the searing heat of a star. He stood up, no longer a flickering ghost, but a celestial warrior anchored to the earth by the weight of my sacrifice. The basement door was suddenly obliterated, not by a physical force but by a wave of pure shadow. The collectors stepped into the room, their faceless hoods turned toward us. They sensed the shift. They sensed that the rules had changed. But as they raised their gray, skeletal hands, Julian stepped forward, the locket around his neck pulsing like a miniature sun. "You took my life," Julian roared, his voice no longer a whisper but a command that shook the very foundations of the earth. "But you cannot take her. And you cannot take what I have become." He raised his hand and a wall of white fire erupted between us and the shadows, a barrier made of the very memory I had just lost. The white fire didn't just burn, it screamed with the echoes of the memory I had just surrendered. As the collectors surged forward, their tattered gray forms dissolving where the light touched them, I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. I knew I should be happy, I knew I should be relieved, but looking at Julian now, solid, powerful, and radiating a heat that singed the air, I felt a pang of terrifying unfamiliarity. The us that had existed on those cliffs was gone from my mind, and in its place was a jagged, raw hole. But there was no time to mourn the lost pieces of my soul. The basement walls were beginning to bleed black ink, and the ceiling was bowing under the weight of something much larger than the three entities standing before us. The lead collector, a creature taller than the others with fingers that trailed like weeping willow branches made of ash, let out a sound that bypassed my ears and went straight into my brain. It was the sound of 1,000 people mourning at once. It raised a hand, and the violet fire Julian had conjured began to flicker and turn gray. "You think a single moment can buy an eternity?" the creature hissed, the voice vibrating through the concrete floor. "She has forgotten the cliff, ghost. And because she has forgotten, the anchor is already rusting." Julian didn't flinch. He reached back and grabbed my hand, and for the first time it didn't feel like ice or electricity. It felt like skin. Felt like a husband. "She didn't forget the love, just the day," Julian countered, his voice booming with a celestial authority. He pulled the silver locket from his neck and pressed it into my palm. Clara, the memory didn't vanish. It transformed. It's not in your head anymore. It's in your hands. Use it. As the collector lunged, its void-like face opening into a maw of infinite darkness, the locket began to expand. It didn't stay a piece of jewelry. It shifted and lengthened, forged by the heat of the violet fire into a shimmering ethereal blade made of pure, crystallized emotion. I gripped the hilt and suddenly the memory rushed back, not as a thought I could look at but as a physical power I could wield. I felt the salt spray of the ocean in my grip. I felt the strength of our vows in my arms. I swung the blade in a wide arc and a crescent of white-hot light cut through the basement. The lead collector didn't just dissipate. It shattered like glass, its fragments evaporating before they could hit the floor. The other two entities shrieked and retreated, merging back into the shadows of the bleeding walls. But the house continued to groan. The great collector, the entity that Julian had swerved to avoid on that dark road, was finally tired of waiting at the gate. The floor beneath us split open, revealing not dirt or pipes, but a swirling vortex of the gray place itself. A churning sea of forgotten souls and stagnant mist. A massive skeletal hand, large enough to crush the entire room, gripped the edge of the rift. The air became so heavy I fell to my knees, the memory blade flickering in my hand. Julian stood over me, his back to the rift, his glowing blue eyes fixed on mine. "The anchor isn't enough to close the rift, Clara," he whispered, the celestial light around him beginning to pulse in sync with the tremors of the house. "To close the door, someone has to push from the other side." I realized what he was saying before he could finish. My heart, already battered by grief and magic, felt like it was being torn in two. "No. Julian, you just got back. You're solid. You're here." I grabbed his shirt, the fabric real and tangible beneath my fingers. But he just smiled, a sad, beautiful expression that looked exactly like the man I had married. "I'm here because you gave up a part of yourself to keep me. But if I stay, the rift stays open and eventually the gray place will swallow this whole town. I came back to save you, Clara. This is how I finish it." He leaned down and kissed me, and for one heartbeat the world was warm, the light was perfect, and the memory of the cliffs returned in full, blinding color. Then he let go. The kiss tasted like starlight and salt, a final, perfect moment of warmth before the cold reality of the universe reasserted itself. Julian pulled away, his face etched with a peaceful resolve that broke my heart more than his death ever had. He turned toward the massive skeletal hand gripping the edge of our reality, his blue light flaring one last time, turning the basement into a cathedral of sapphire fire. "I finally remember the face of the soul I saved that night, Clara," he said, his voice echoing from a great distance even though he stood only inches away. "It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a ghost. It was the part of you that was supposed to die of a broken heart 10 years from now. I didn't swerve to miss a spirit. I swerved to give you a future." With a roar that shook the stars, Julian leaped into the vortex. He didn't go as a victim but as a conqueror. I watched as his light collided with the great collector, a brilliant explosion of white and blue that illuminated the swirling depths of the gray place. The massive skeletal hand recoiled, scorched by the purity of a sacrifice that defied every law of the afterlife. The rift began to seal, the jagged edges of the floor knitting themselves back together like a wound healing in seconds. "Julian!" I screamed, reaching for the closing gap, but the memory blade in my hand dissolved into a shower of silver sparks, flowing into the floorboards to seal the breach forever. The house fell into a deathly perfect silence. The gray fog outside the windows evaporated, replaced by the soft purple hues of a real summer dawn. I sat on the basement floor, my hands trembling, staring at the spot where the world had opened up. It was just concrete again, cracked, dusty and mundane. The locket lay in the center of the floor, its silver surface dull and cold. I picked it up, expecting to feel that hollow void in my mind, but something was different. The memory of the cliffs was there. It was faint, like a photograph left in the sun, but the feeling, the absolute, unshakable knowledge that I was loved, remained anchored in my chest. Weeks passed and the haunted reputation of the house faded into the gossip of the neighborhood. I went through the motions of life, but I never felt alone. I kept the coffee pot brewing every morning, and sometimes when the wind was just right, the steam would curl into a shape that looked like a hand reaching for mine. I kept the locket around my neck, and on the nights when the moon was full and the air was still, it would pulse with a faint rhythmic heat, a heartbeat that didn't belong to the living but wouldn't surrender to the dead. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the fireflies, I felt a familiar cold breath against my neck. It wasn't the biting frost of the collectors. It was a gentle electric hum that made the hair on my arms stand up. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I simply moved to the side of the porch swing, leaving exactly enough room for someone else to sit. The wood creaked softly under a weight that wasn't there, and the air beside me grew heavy with the scent of cedarwood and rain. A translucent hand, shimmering like moonlight on water, rested over mine. It wasn't solid and it couldn't stay for long, but it was enough. Our love hadn't ended when he died. It hadn't even ended when he returned to the shadows. It had become the very fabric of my world, a supernatural guardianship that kept the darkness at bay. I realized then that Julian hadn't just saved me from a car accident or a broken heart. He had taught me that the veil between worlds is only as thick as our fear. As long as I remembered him, as long as I carried the light he gave me, the door would never truly be closed. I leaned my head back against the air, closing my eyes and smiling as I felt the ghost of a kiss touch my brow. The story of Julian and Clara wasn't a tragedy of the grave. It was a legend of the light that follows.